Hi, this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. I'm at Golden Garden Park today. It's quite nice today, not a lot of people, and it's a sunny day today, which is kind of nice in Seattle. I'm hanging out with the family and I didn't bring my plein air set, so that was a pity, but I decided to maybe go around, spot for certain locations that is great for painting subject. So I'm gonna share with you how do I pick a subject, and hopefully that will be helpful for you as well. So I'm just going to go around and show you some spot that I think potentially can be a good subject. Okay, so this is the parking lot, and as I walk in here, I saw this house there, and I kind of immediately tell that this is going to be a good shape for me to paint. Now that being said, this view right here is probably not the ideal angle per se for painting, because it's just like this really big shape right there and the trees kind of in front of it blocking it, which can be an interesting shape, but the lighting is also not helping. Right now the light is way up there, you can kind of tell by the shadow, so it's almost kind of backlit, so everything looks really dark except the roof. Usually when I'm finding the good subject that has potential, I will walk around just to see if there's any other angle that offers better composition and lighting, value, contrast, etc. So I'm going to walk around and see if I can find any other angle that's better for painting. Okay, so we're next to the beach and the lighting looks a lot better. I can actually see the color of the brick building, which is quite nice. And we got ocean there. So I think this is now a much better subject to paint. That being said, I still think the building is a little bit too big if this is the composition that we're going for. So what I usually do is I will probably back up quite a bit more, just to have it fit maybe a little bit better in the rule of third grid without just expanding across. Because if the building is that big in your subject, you're probably going to be forced to work into all the details of the windows and the door and stuff. So that's probably not a good idea since I'm not a very detail-oriented painter. And the other thing is I will probably walk to the other side of the building and look back and see if I can get some nice composition, because I do believe these large trees are going to serve very well as a background against this building. So we'll see. Okay, so I walked about, 2 minutes or so, and just as I predicted, I feel this view, this composition is much better. Instead of taking a huge majority space of the picture, the building is now still our focus of the painting, but it feels a little bit more manageable. And with the contrast of the background, mountain trees and this tall big trees in the foreground, I feel like this is going to be a much better painting. However, there's one more thing I'm going to do, and it's this. I am going to zoom it in a little bit. Okay. Now I can take a photo with the previous view and just crop it a little bit later, but this is just for me to visualize this quote-unquote painting in a much better context. So I can imagine this being painted with people playing volleyballs and that building there and the trees on the top. Makes a really nice shape, and also a little bit of ocean in the background. That's always nice as well. And that's another thing, just because I am at the beach, I'm at the ocean, doesn't mean I need to include the ocean. Okay, if you can somehow manage to include that, great, but if not, focus on getting a good picture instead of really trying to fit in everything you think that is important. This looks really nice. That looks very relaxing. Okay, so I walk a little bit to the other side of the building. So actually this side they're selling some snacks, trees and stuff, which is quite nice. And I really like that little red umbrella there catching the light, pops out in the shadow. It looks really nice. So just as I predicted, I think those trees in the background serves a very nice contrast to make the house kind of pops out a lot more. And I think leaving the house on the right bottom and seeing a little bit of the beach, the ocean in the background there is quite nice. Of course, probably a good idea to paint several people camping on the beach and stuff. That volleyball net, I'll probably need to leave it out if I will paint that, so that I don't have to include everything, especially things that are not as important. So this is also a great painting subject, I believe. So definitely worth the walk. I don't know, just a few minutes, but it definitely worth the walk just to check out the other side. Okay, so I walked with my family for about 5 minutes or so to get some soft serve ice cream. And when I look back to the house, the public restroom, this looks really nice. It looks really interesting. Now this is what I'm talking about when you want more water in your scene, because look at all this body of water, and yet if I zoom it in like I just did, the house is still in relatively viewable size. And I think that house pops out in front of all that trees with some waters on the bottom. That makes it very interesting painting subject, especially if you want more water in it and to speak beach. Now this is a lot further, so all the figures in the scene is going to be very little, very small, but this is a great subject, this is a great composition to show more water. So if I make the sky a little bit more interesting, this is actually going to be a great painting subject. So there's some boat here. I mean, there's way too many boats here, so that's not going to be good for painting. But this one particularly, I do think is a decent painting subject. And actually, the more I look at this particular scene, the more I find it interesting, because this two boats sets a really interesting contrast. One is pretty old and one is relatively new. So I think a lot of time when we come across something, we try to take it all in, and there's a lot of stuff going on. We got buildings, we got water, we got boat, we got a bunch of masts in the background. But if we try to zoom it in, if we try to just focusing on little things in this scenery, we might find something like this that's quite interesting. So whenever you come across some interesting scenery, instead of trying to include everything that you see, maybe find something that piques your interest and compose your image around it. Okay, welcome back to the studio. So I took some photos. Let's take a look at them together and see what we can come up with. So let's take a look at some of the photos that I took. So the first thing I usually do is to crop it, maybe recompose it a little bit. So because I use Photoshop, I use the crop tool. It will have root of third grid. I usually like to use that to compose my image. So immediately when I crop it out, it feels like the house start to become a much more important role in this case, because if I don't crop it, there's just a lot of tree over here that's not necessarily going to be interesting to paint, because there's just going to be a lot of dark shape. And I do think this hammock is very interesting. So if I paint this one, I will probably crop it like this so that we don't have a lot of extra space over there. But I might move the hammock a little bit to the left, so it will be something kind of like this. If I'm going to paint this, I will probably do something like that, so we have a little bit of interesting colorful element here. Now this is another one that I think potentially is a good image. So again, I'll probably crop it. This two people right there is very distracting because I want the viewer to focus a little bit more in the building. So I will probably crop it, something like that. So I think that's good. Again, I wouldn't keep the extra space here like that. I think just way too many trees. I think something like these would be great. And I will probably get rid of these two people. I have no problem with them, but I just don't think they're going to be helpful in this painting. And if we take a look at this two figure becomes somewhat of more of a major figure that's going to lead us into the scene. So I think this will be a good, much better image to paint with compared to the original one. So always try to recompose a little bit, even when you took a very nice photo. So this one, where we walk a little bit out into the distance, is very similar to this one. However, it's a lot further and we can start to focus a little bit more on the bigger scenery. So we crop it down a little bit so that the house position nicely here. And then we can maybe focus a little bit more on the sky by lowering this down. We still have some ocean, some water here, where we can kind of recompose it a little bit so that the water can somewhat connect to the background. Now, of course, when we paint it, we can shrink this part a little bit. So it's going to be a little bit more like these. We can kind of shrink this lens down just a little bit. Okay, this is very, very quick, but you get the point. So again, always try to recompose it, work on it a little bit. Now let's take a look at these two photos. I was mentioning about the boat. I find this two boat contrast quite interesting. One a little bit older, one relatively newer. But look at just the amount of the detail in the surrounding. So I think if we want to focus on the boat, we can do a vertical orientation. That way we can set the orientation of the painting to match up with the boat a little bit better. So maybe we can do something like these. This will be a little bit different. So I find this composition very interesting. We can focus on the boat a lot more, and we can actually see quite a bit of the water, and the water almost becomes its own character as well, with all the reflection and ripples and such. Now, of course, I will need to simplify the background by a lot, but I feel like this is a lot more interesting, has a much better focus than this image right here, which is beautiful, but I think this is much more interesting and a lot more simple to paint. So for this video, I decided to paint this photo. I think it is a very typical beach scenery, but it does reminded me of a good time that I had there. So hopefully in the future, I will have time and do videos on other paintings from the photos that I took. But for this video, I'm going to demo on this one. Okay, so let's take a look at this painting. We will start off with a line drawing. Now in the beginning of the line drawing, all you really need to do is to figure out the placement and the scales of things. So when I took the photo, I already composed it a little bit, and then I come back home with the photo and I recompose it further. And now when I'm actually doing the line drawing, that's another chance for you to recompose your painting. So it's not unusual for me to change my composition a couple of times throughout this process. So now I'm starting to draw the figures. Now in the beginning, I'm a little bit dreaded with the amount of figures in this scenery. However, the only figures that I need to really pay attention to is the two figures that's a little bit closer to us that leads our eyes into the house and the background. So those are the figures that I need to watch out for, their anatomy, proportion, and so on. Everything else, they are just going to be smaller shapes. You can easily convince the viewer that they're figures by strategically place some brushstrokes. Now, just to make things a little bit easier for me, I decided to do a value study for this painting. So I'm using a smaller paper here. The line drawing is much looser and rougher. The main purpose is really just for me to explore the value grouping in this painting. So I start with the middle value, and I see the background trees, the house, and the background mountain. They are all in the middle value, as well as some of the figures. Now within the middle value, that's where I'm going to paint the dark value. But right now we have two values, which is the white of the paper, which is the light area, and the middle value, which is the part that I'm painting right now. So immediately we created a major shape. Value study is very, very valuable, no pun intended. And the reason it's so valuable is that it can really help you to simplify your image. And by painting it, instead of using other tools like computer or even pencil drawing, is that you can get into the painting mode by playing with the paint and practicing your brushstrokes and washes and so on. In fact, I often suggest my student to just do the value study. Don't even try to do color version if you're just getting started. But unfortunately, some students are not really that patient with themselves. Actually, they really want to get ahead and paint a nice looking colorful painting. And I also don't want to deflate their motivation. So a lot of time when they skip the value study, I don't really say anything. But I still strongly suggest my students and even you who is watching this video right now to do some value study and enjoy the process. So now I'm starting to paint the dark value, and that will be those shadow, the dark places underneath the tree, and I have that connect to the wall of the house so that we can have the rooftop be a little bit lighter without popping out too much. And now I'm painting the figures. They're wearing black. And I also add a little bit of dark to the background figures so they pop out. So that's the very quick value study. And you notice that I didn't paint anything for the sky, the water, and the sand because I grouped them all as light value, which I'm going to start working on them when I'm doing the final color painting. So let's start with the color painting. I pre-wet the sky because I want to start with the blue sky and some nice looking cloud. Now the clouds in the photo are pretty soft, they are not overly dramatic, so I'm going to keep that in my painting. That being said, I am going to give the silhouette of the cloud just a little bit more bumpiness. So I pre-wet some of the area while keeping some of the place dry, so you see a little bit of hard edges in the edges of the cloud. Adding a little bit more dark underneath so they have more volumes. You do that wet onto wet so those volume will be soft as well. And now I continue the first wash down. And also start to pre-wet some of the area for some vibrant color like the red umbrella and the skin tones. And the reason I pre-wet those areas is because I don't want any hard edges for now. I just want the color of the light. And now I continue the wash down, painting the wash for the water and the distant haze. Now I'm also adding some green. Now these greens are very, very light, especially after they dry. So I will definitely need to go in and make it a little bit darker as well. Keep in mind that this is the first wash, so I'm actually not painting any medium value for now. Even though some of the color when I just put it down, it looks a little bit darker. But as they dry out, because the first wash is so wet, they are going to be much lighter when they dry. So I'm taking a big brush and finish the wash for the sand. And now I have a nice clean wash. And before it is completely dry, I do a little bit of the texture wet onto wet, just so that the sand doesn't feel like a flat plane, have a little bit of the texture and bumpiness. Now the background is pretty much dry, so time for my second wash. It's a clear sunny day, so there's no fog, so the background can be clear without much soft edges. Just keep the detail to the minimum. I only did a tiny little bit of detail for the silhouette and maybe leave a little bit of highlight for some suggestive detail in the background. Other than that, everything is just a single flat shape. Now I have that connected to the bushes in the background and as well as the trees. And as you can see, as soon as I put down the second wash, the middle value, the first wash feels a lot lighter. You can still tell the difference between the blue sky and the white cloud, but that value change is minimum compared to the light value and the middle value. And I paint the background trees as a single group and give it a little bit of dry brush mark to the trees on the right. They are a little bit looser, so you see individual leaves. Some wet onto wet before this shape is dry. I want to give it a little bit of the darker value so you can feel the transition from light to dark. And just like the clouds, we want to have a little bit of volume in this group of trees. And now I'm mixing a cool gray for the rooftop. And keep in mind, these are middle value. Don't just leave them light value just because they are receiving light. Think about their local color and how will they react in the given lighting scenario. Not everything lit by the sun will be light. The water is light because the reflection of the sky, and the sky is very, very light as well because of the atmosphere. The sands are very light because they're local color. But if you compare the sand with the rooftop, the sands are noticeably lighter. So I continue to paint the house with middle value. And now I start to paint some of the figures in the background. This is a bit of a pain because the shapes are really small, and I do want to give them a little bit of colors. So I'm painting a bunch of smaller shapes. And it's very easy to get carried away when you are painting details, so make sure you don't get stuck in them. It's funny because you know it's summer when friends around you starting to share photos of beaches that they are in, and even the artists starting to paint more beach scenery. So this is my contribution. But it is very exciting to see sunny days. We've been having a lot more rainy and cloudy days. And while I personally don't mind raining and cloudy days, but my wife is very happy whenever she sees a sunny day. So just for that, I appreciate it. So now we have our light value and some middle value. So it's time to paint the dark value. So the shadows underneath the trees, the branches and the tree trunks, these are the dark value. And the dark values are usually a lot more sophisticated as well. So they're usually related to small details. So like the tree branches here, try to keep them nice and delicate. That's why I just use the tip of the brush to paint some of the shapes. Now that being said, also try not to make them too busy because it is very easy, again, to get carried away when you are painting the details. So sometimes I do go back and fill up some of the empty spaces so we don't end up a bunch of small fragments of dark shapes. And just like the value study, I connect the dark part of the trees to the wall of the houses. And as soon as I paint this dark value, the rooftops start to pop out a lot more. It actually looks a little bit too light, but I actually don't mind that. I actually think that looks nice, so I didn't darken that much. I do give it a little bit more detail though, because the stuff on the rooftop casting some shadows and stuff. We'll get to that later. Carefully paint around the umbrella, preserve that light, that red, painting some dark occlude the shadow right underneath the roof, create a little bit more space. And here I added another wall. I forgot to paint that one. So now just some quick details, some shadows, things like that. And we got a solid looking house. Adding some details to the distant figures. I'm trying to refine the shape so that we don't have excessive white space around the figures. Adding smaller shapes so they can be figures, chairs, whatever it is really too far away, so just a couple of random abstract shapes. And when I'm painting these two figures on the right, I realize that I make them too tall, too big. Because if they are closer to us, I actually need to lower them, so the height of their head is more similar to the figures in the back. So the way I try to sort of fix that is to paint over them and go back a little bit later to make them smaller. So I try to move away from those right now and start to paint the smaller figures in the back. Now, beach is definitely not the flattest scene in the world, so you will have some figures a little bit higher, some figures a little bit lower. But when I was painting that, I feel like the figures on the right doesn't really feel natural. That's why I just paint them over and try to change the scale. And now I'm painting the two main figures in the front. So adding the dark on the figure, it is black hair and he's wearing black as well, so that makes things easy. But also the dark shadow on his skin tone. A little bit hint of that creates some light on him. Adding the cast shadow so he's not floating. I'm working on another figure. So while these two figures are a bit bigger, I still try to keep it loose. The painting is almost done actually. I add an umbrella there on the right and just tiny bit more touches for the figures in the back. Now back to the figures on the right. I just added some dark hair and the body and I changes their scale. Added a seagull in the sky to create a sense of space. Couple more tiny little details, a bit more texture on the sand. And here we have the finished painting. It's a simple painting aside from quite a bit of figures. And again, by recompose it when you take the photo and recompose it after you come back home, that can also make your image a little bit more focused. A nice simple subject is much easier to work with than something that's overly complicated and crammed with stuff. So I hope this video is helpful for you. So I think the main thing that we should think about when we go out and look for scenery to paint is that never settle for the first thing that you see. Always walk around a little bit, change a different angle. Maybe if you have time, you can wait for different lightings and such. With a little bit of patience and determination, you can have something that's really suitable for painting. So if you think about it, we spend about an hour or two trying to do a painting, but if we are not willing to spend maybe 5 to 15 more minutes trying to get a better subject to paint with, then that will be a huge waste of opportunity. So if you like this content, consider to give it a like and subscribe. Ring the bell icon so you won't miss out another video like this one. I'm Eric from Cafe Watercolor. Hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are. See you next time.